The truck's engine roared as it drove down a dusty road deep in the heart of the forest. Harper Grant, sitting in the passenger seat, couldn't stop staring at the landscape unfolding before her. Nature surrounded them in a stillness that felt almost too perfect, and as she watched the tall trees and the light filtering through their leaves, she felt, for a moment, out of place. Even with the window down, the fresh air didn't quite ease the discomfort she felt being so far from her comfort zone. The city was her terrain and she knew how to navigate it.
"This is the best, Harper. Trust me,"
said Megan, her best friend, driving with enthusiasm. Megan had always been the optimist of the group, the one who saw adventures where others saw problems. It wasn't unusual for her to have convinced Harper to join her on this strange weekend of camping. A weekend of disconnection was Megan's idea to finally get Harper to put down her phone and immerse herself in nature. Harper sighed, her gaze fixed on the horizon with an expression of skepticism.
"I'd call spending an entire weekend without Wi-Fi more of a torture than an adventure. But I guess I'll have to let the fresh air heal me, right?"
she replied sarcastically. Megan let out a small laugh but didn't respond, simply turning on the radio, and calming music filled the air. Soon they arrived at the trailhead that would lead them to the campsite, where the backpacks and tents would be their home for the next 3 days. The place was popular with hikers, a sizable forest, but with no dark history attached. It wasn't known for disappearances or creepy legends, just a recreational area that was sometimes crowded with tourists but mostly retained its peaceful, natural essence. After unloading the gear and getting organized, the group set out toward the camp. Chris, the unofficial leader of the group, was at the front, always organized and confident. Jake, the joker, followed behind, making jokes about everything, while Olivia, the quiet and creative friend, stayed a step behind, always observing. Harper tried to do her best to enjoy the hike, but her mind kept drifting back to her powered-off phone. Shortly after they entered the forest, as the group made their way down a wide path, something unusual caught Harper's attention. On the trunk of a large tree, there was a small wooden figure nailed to it, hand-carved. It wasn't very big, but its humanoid shape and the twisted lines on its face, like a grotesque expression of despair, made Harper furrow her brow. The object felt out of place.
"What's that?"
she asked, stopping. Megan walked over with curiosity.
"It could be some kind of local art or part of a tradition. Some call it folk art."
"Art?"
Jake commented, leaning in to take a closer look.
"I don't know. That looks more like a warning. Someone's trying to scare us."
He joked, though there was something in his tone that Harper couldn't quite place. Olivia was quieter than usual, her eyes scanning the wooden figure with a serious expression.
"I don't like it. There's something off about it."
Chris, who had been silent until then, stepped forward and nudged the figure with the tip of his boot.
"It's just a stupid wooden figure. There's nothing to be afraid of. Let's move on."
Harper tried to laugh off her own unease, but she couldn't shake the strange feeling the figure had left in her stomach. Something wasn't right. She decided not to say anything, but as the group continued on their way, she couldn't help but glance back at the tree. There was something about that figure that unsettled her in a way she couldn't understand. The trail continued for a couple of hours until the group reached a clearing that seemed ideal for camping. It was a spot with panoramic views, surrounded by tall trees that appeared to embrace the area, creating a sense of peace that only nature could provide. However, as they began setting up their tents, something strange made them stop. Just a few meters from where they planned to camp, they found the remains of another campsite, an extinguished campfire, burned wood, and some belongings scattered across the ground. There was a ripped tent with strange marks that didn't look like animal tracks, and a partially open backpack as if someone had left in a hurry.
"What happened here?"
Megan asked, raising an eyebrow.
"Probably a couple of tourists abandoned the place,"
Chris said practically.
"Sometimes people don't take the park's rules seriously."
But Harper wasn't so convinced. She looked around as if something was lurking in the shadows of the trees. Suddenly she felt small, vulnerable. There was something unsettling about this place, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was.
And why would they leave their backpacks?
Jake asked, pointing to the torn backpack near the fire.
This doesn't seem normal.
Harper crouched down to examine the backpack and in doing so, saw something that chilled her to the bone. Another wooden figure, much larger than the others, hanging from a nearby branch. It was broken in half, but the carved lines on its face were unmistakable.
I don't like this.
Harper muttered, looking up at her friends. Olivia slowly approached the figure, studying it closely.
We shouldn't stay here. There's something strange about all of this.
Chris frowned and, trying to downplay it, said,
It's just a bad campsite. Someone probably came, saw the place wasn't to their liking, and left. Nothing to worry about.
Megan nodded, but Harper could see that her friend, usually so positive, also had some unease on her face. The atmosphere had subtly shifted. Suddenly the abandoned camp didn't seem so harmless anymore. Nightfall descended quickly upon the forest, and with it, the feeling of isolation intensified. The sounds of insects and nocturnal animals filled the air, but there was something strange about the silence that reigned over their campsite. As they gathered around the campfire, the sensation of being watched lingered, though no one mentioned it aloud. Jake was attempting to joke around, telling scary stories that only made Harper more uncomfortable. Stories about witches and forest spirits, though clearly fictional, added more tension to the atmosphere.
And then, the witch took the campers, one by one, and turned them into wooden figurines to decorate her forest.
Jake said with a macabre tone, looking at the others with wide, gleaming eyes.
Really?
Chris responded, though he didn't seem so convinced by Jake's jokes.
And how does that explain the missing campers?
Well, sure.
Jake replied.
Someone could have run off because of a bear or something. But what if it was the witch?
Olivia, who hadn't said much during the afternoon, suddenly whispered,
I do believe in witches, or at least in something that lives in these woods.
Megan laughed, but her eyes showed an unease that Harper hadn't noticed before.
Come on, Olivia. That doesn't make sense. It's just a myth.
Megan responded, trying to sound confident. Harper looked at Olivia, who seemed completely absorbed in her own world. The girl's eyes were shining with an unusual intensity, as though she were seeing something beyond the fire. The others were busy with the conversation, but Harper felt that there was something strange in the air. The sound of the wind and the murmurs of the trees felt too close, as if the forest itself were breathing. That night, Harper couldn't sleep. The creaking of the branches, the cold breeze passing through the leaves, everything seemed to be part of an eerie symphony. There was something in the air, something surrounding her, something watching her. Was it just the stress of being so far from her familiar world, or was there something else in the forest, something she was beginning to notice? In the stillness of the darkness, she heard a whisper. A low, almost imperceptible whisper. She quickly turned but saw nothing. Silence returned. But for a moment, she swore she saw a tall, hooded figure among the trees, with eyes glowing in the darkness. She jolted and took a deep breath. It couldn't be real. Or yes. The following dawn arrived with an unusual heaviness. The sky was covered with gray clouds, and the humidity in the air, which had always been refreshing, now felt like a weight pressing against their chests. The trees, usually a pleasant refuge, seemed taller and darker than usual, and the paths that had once seemed clear and easy to navigate now felt like labyrinths. Harper, still heavy with sleep, noticed that her friends were already awake, but there was something about them that wasn't the same.
Is there coffee?
She asked, rubbing her eyes as she sat down next to the extinguished campfire. Megan was silent, her face pale and her eyes glowing with palpable discomfort. Normally, she was always cheerful, but this time her enthusiasm seemed forced, as if she were trying to maintain normalcy despite the unease she was clearly feeling.
I've been going through the backpack.
Megan murmured as she pulled something out of her bag.
The maps are all wet, the GPS has no signal, and my phone's dead. This isn't normal, Harper.
Harper nodded, but she couldn't deny that something strange was happening. The forest seemed to be transforming slowly, as if the air was becoming thicker and the space was compressing around them. The faint sound of crunching leaves turned into a pressure in her ears. And the broken wooden figure they had found the previous day, the one Jake had thrown, kept haunting her thoughts, a constant reminder that something sinister was lurking. Olivia, who had remained even more silent than Megan, suddenly stood up and began walking without saying a word, her notebook in hand. Her steps seemed erratic and hesitant, as if she couldn't make up her mind.
Olivia.
Harper called, but the girl didn't respond. She just kept walking toward the edge of the camp, staring ahead with a vacant expression. Chris, who was usually the most rational of the group, tried to stop her, but Olivia ignored him. He followed her for a while until they both reached the edge of a small ravine where a dense fog covered the trees.
Are you okay?
Chris asked, his voice low, but there was something in his tone that indicated more discomfort than genuine concern. Olivia turned slowly toward him, and what Harper saw froze her blood. Olivia's eyes, which used to be soft, now looked empty, as if she had lost all sense of herself. Her face was pale, and her lips trembled slightly.
I shouldn't be here. We shouldn't be here.
She murmured, her voice breaking. Chris grabbed her arm, but Olivia violently pulled away.
Don't come near me!
She screamed, her voice full of panic.
Don't come near me! They're watching us!
Harper watched, paralyzed, as Chris tried to calm her down. Then suddenly Olivia took a step back and tripped, falling to the ground. She didn't scream or complain. She simply lay still, staring at the forest with wide, unblinking eyes.
Olivia!
Megan shouted, running toward her, but the girl's response was chilling.
She's here! She's coming! She's going to find us all!
Megan's eyes grew wide with terror.
Who's coming? Olivia! Who?
Olivia, with a smile that was anything but human, whispered.
The witch! She's here!
At that moment, the wind began to pick up, shaking the branches of the trees and casting dancing shadows on the ground. The atmosphere that had once seemed peaceful was now saturated with a palpable sense of danger. No one spoke for a long time. No one knew how to react. Harper nodded, but something inside her, something she couldn't explain, told her they shouldn't search for Olivia. The figure of the witch, the one Olivia had mentioned earlier, began to take shape in her mind. It wasn't a witch like the ones in fairy tales, but a shadow slipping between the trees, watching them at all times. The search for Olivia was futile. No one saw or heard anything else from her. She had simply vanished, as if the forest itself had swallowed her whole. Night fell quickly, darker than the night before. As the group tried to set up their tents and start a fire, something seemed to follow them. The crunch of branches under their feet, the whisper of the wind seeping through the leaves, everything felt more intense, more immediate. Harper didn't know if she was imagining things, but she swore she heard footsteps in the distance, footsteps that didn't belong to her friends. She looked around but saw nothing.
Harper?
Megan said softly, approaching her. The fear on her face was clear.
Are you okay?
The afternoon passed in silence. No one wanted to speak about what had happened with Olivia, not even Megan, who had been the closest to her. The girls seemed to have lost touch with reality, and though Chris had tried to convince her to return to camp, Olivia simply stood up and began walking aimlessly, disappearing into the trees.
What are we going to do?
Harper asked, fear creeping into her voice.
We can't stay here.
Chris said firmly.
This is insane. We need to find Olivia and get out of this damn forest.
Harper, a mix of fear and exhaustion flooding her, nodded, but her breathing quickened. The figure of the witch she had seen in her mind now seemed to be taking form in the trees. A tall, slender silhouette, hooded, with eyes glowing in the darkness.
We're not alone.
She suddenly screamed, taking a step back. The others, alarmed, rushed toward her. But when they looked back at the forest, everything had fallen silent. There was nothing there. Only the dark, thick mass of trees. However, the air was now filled with a strange smell, a mixture of dampness and something else, something more acidic. Harper felt her head start to cloud, and the figures of her friends began to distort before her. Their faces stretched, their eyes grew glassy, and their movements became erratic.
Harper?
Megan looked at her, but her face seemed unreal, like she was looking through her. Harper began coughing, the air feeling heavy in her chest. The wooden figures, the ones she had seen before, began appearing around the camp, almost as if they were watching their every move. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew she couldn't hold on much longer. The last day was as strange as the first, but everything seemed to be crumbling around her. When Harper woke up, she was alone in the camp. There was no sign of her friends, only the wooden figures nailed to the trees, now far more numerous than before. The voices in her head grew louder. The wind whispered her name as if the forest itself was calling to her. Her mind began to cloud entirely, and when she looked into the distance, she saw a tall, thin figure, hooded, waiting for her among the trees. She wasn't sure if it was real or if she had lost her mind, but what she knew for certain was that she couldn't run. In her desperation, she walked toward the figure. As she drew closer, the fog began to close around her, and with every step, the trees seemed to lean in toward her. Finally, the figure slowly turned. Harper saw its face, but it wasn't human. It was a twisted mask, as if it belonged to another world, and the witch smiled, extending a hand toward her. A strangled scream caught in her throat, but it was already too late. When the park rangers found the campsite, it was intact. There were only the traces of a group that never returned. There were no signs of struggle or destruction, but something in the air made the place feel marked by an unsettling stillness. The forest remained a popular destination for campers. No one knew what had really happened, but some claimed to see shadows moving between the trees, or hear whispers when the wind blew just right. The legend of the witch still lingered, though nothing had ever been confirmed. The story of the missing friends, however, remained in the air, like an echo from the forest that never stopped whispering.